So this evening we have two poets reading from Michael Yost, who recently completed his Master's of Fine Arts from the University of St. Thomas under the direction of Timothy Steele. Is that who directed the thesis? But was brought to the program through James Matthew Wilson. And Michael Yost is the admissions director at Thomas More College. Those of us who are at the college know him as our admissions director. And but he has been writing poetry for a long time. I have the distinguished pleasure of having taught him in writing tutorial, and I was trying to dig up some dirt earlier today. And I decided against reading from early collections of things that Michael wrote, just in the interest of time. But Michael... Michael is, and I think there's something that unites both of the men who will be reading from their poems this evening. And I was trying to think about, obviously they're separated by years, but they are both doing something that's so central to the reinvigoration of letters in our country, and especially of Catholic articulation of poetry, and an expression that may seem a little outdated, it kept coming up in mind, and that is men of letters. So the Merriam-Webster dictionary, if you look up man of letters, it has a definition, but it helpfully reminds us that the plural of man of letters is men of letters. And I kept coming back to this expression because of Russell Kirk. And I know James Matthew Wilson and I met in Mecosta at the Kirk Center. That was our first meeting. And Russell Kirk has been very formative in my intellectual formation and in what we do at Thomas More College. And I think both of these men are doing something that is central, rare, and unique. And I want to just draw a couple of comparisons and sort of reflect very briefly on what it is that distinguishes them. So they're both very deeply family men. So I've never met Hillary, but I know the name from the volumes of poetry, and Michael is married to Mary Grace, who is an alum of Thomas More College. They have 4 children. They're very deeply committed to family. They love their wives. They're very involved in their communities. And they both understand the centrality of family and commitment to the community and commitment to place. They're very much poets of place. And I know what Michael's going to be reading this evening. I'm not exactly sure, but just from having read St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds and all of your other work, I know, and as a fellow Michigander, I know how important place is in your writing. And I was looking back over some things that Russell Kirk had written on the man of letters, and obviously he's thinking of T.S. Eliot, and he's thinking of that long tradition of integrating criticism and poetry and the lived experience of living a full life in harmony with the truth. So Kirk said, the moral imagination aspires to the apprehending of right order in the soul and right order in the commonwealth. And a recent editor of Modern Age, when I was at ISI, I was involved with Modern Age, and George Panichis, who was a former editor, said, it is the numinous quality of reverence that distinguishes the man of letters from the atomistic critic, and that defines and undergirds his faith. And I would say that both of these poets exhibit that numinous quality of reverence in their work. They have a great piety in the fullest sense of the word. Piety as an attachment to place, piety as reverence for something beyond themselves. And they both understand, in the fullest sense, the vicissitudes of life and the frailties and triumphs of the human heart. So without further ado, I introduce Michael Yost. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Dr. Fahey, and thank you all for being here tonight. I'm very honored to be able to do this, and especially to be the opening act for James Matthew Wilson. So I'm very grateful to him and to the program that he ran at University of St. Thomas in Houston. If there's anyone at Thomas More or anyone watching or listening to this who is interested in a creative writing program, it's the best one on offer. It's something that, I've been, as Mrs. Fahey noted, I've been writing poetry of one degree of quality or another for some time. And it was really only through this program that I think that I received the tools and the instruction necessary to fully, or at least to begin realizing what I wanted to do. So that's something I wanted to say at the beginning of this. So my plan for tonight is simply to give a brief introduction to the poems I've selected for tonight. I'll give one individually for each one. I'll try and keep it relatively short and expository. Maybe giving a little bit of background as to the origin of the poem, maybe some explanatory framework if necessary. The reason that each of these poems is in here is because going through the pages and pages of stuff I have on file, this stuff sounded the best. So it's selected for the ear. It's not in any particular order. It's not on any particular subject. So that's really the criterion I used in selecting these. So hopefully that is borne out in the performance. The first two poems are from a series of poems that I have not yet finished, called The Choice. And these poems are both rather short. They're only about 8 lines long each, 9 lines long. They're based off of Book 10 of Plato's Republic, when Socrates is expounding what the afterlife looks like. And for him, the individual soul is reincarnated after death, but its reincarnation is determined by the life it's lived before. And the character of the human being, as they lived their previous life, is lived out in their reincarnation. And they actually get to choose what their life is. But their choice is obviously determined by who they are. Their character determines their future. So the epigraph for this series is from Book 10. Mortal souls, behold a new cycle of life and mortality. Your genius will not be allotted to you, but you will choose your genius. And the first poem is on Agamemnon. The Eagle. Proud and noble, I hunt now the parkland of the sky. I shoot towards them like a falling arrow, the heelet, rabbit, lamb, and sparrow, and in the shortest space of breath, introduce them to the court of death. I, Agamemnon, chose this life, who hate both man and wife. And obviously the last line I feel kind of silly reading that one after Mrs. Fahey was talking about what a wonderful family man I am. But obviously not everything I write is about me. Agamemnon obviously was betrayed by his wife, Clytemnestra, because of him sacrificing his only daughter to the gods in the story. So he, disgusted by the faithlessness of the human race, chose to become an animal rather than being reincarnated as a human. And the second poem is called The Tyrant. And of course, the tyrant features the tyrant is a central character in Plato's Republic because he's the shadow side of the philosopher king. So the person who becomes the tyrant in his next life is obviously someone who lived a less than noble life prior. But this is how I imagined that going. The tyrant. In my last birth I did not know the good, nor could I bear the lusts within my breast. But after death I chose but what I could, and I sought power, being dispossessed. Now I enslave, who am a slave as base. My passions and the city are as one. It bears my image, its coin bears my face, beneath the mad eclipse of reason's sun. So the next two poems, are epigrams, taken from the French skeptic and writer of maxims, Roquefort. And his maxims are often witty, usually fairly cynical, but some of them are insightful, and these are two. So his epigrams are written in prose, and so what I did was I translated them, and then I versified what I had translated. So the form is original to me, and the word choice is original, but the material is taken from Roquefort. Epigram 26. Men cannot bear the white of noonday's sun's bright light, with open eyes exposed, nor can they bear the sight of death's all-blinding night, without their eyes half closed. And then epigram 102. The head, though smart, will let itself be led, and fooled and ruled, instead, by that unthinking part, the heart. And then serendipitously, after that, I have a short poem called A Charm Against Eros. By these strong words I now unstring your bow and break your arrows, O deadliest of archers. Sting not this my mortal flesh with darts fletched from the lecherous sparrow's brown feathers, nor enmesh me in your net of hot desires, woven from hell's own fires. And that one is directly inspired by a series of poems written by the poet Timothy Steele called Sapphics Against Anger, which are sort of individual prayers, which presumably, he doesn't seem like someone who struggles with anger. If anyone's ever met him, he's very sweet. But the poems inspired that. So this is a longer poem, and this is one of those poems that I think Mrs. Fahey had in mind when she talked about the poetry of place. This is actually, it's written about a bridge near my current home. Well, we're moving actually, so it's not my home anymore. But it's a city called Pembroke, it's a town called Pembroke in New Hampshire. And it's about a river and a bridge that are near that town. And it's dedicated to my oldest son, Charles Augustine. The bridge. The Merrimack runs past our town, north from the White Mountains, past old Canterbury, conquered, bends sharply to eastward and then tends meanderingly southward down, towards the sea at last. Above those broad, cold mountain currents, 3 separate bridges throw themselves across the river's span, like past and future in a man. Small waves are born and die, recurrence within the onward flow. One, wide and heavy, dark with rust, is laid with railroad tracks. Another, in a gentle arc of concrete, looms both new and stark, ripe with exhaust and noise and dust from Fords and Pontiacs. I walk across the third with Charles. This footbridge, in the heat of noon and springtime, come to strength. And as we step across its length, the wood, with its cross-sectioned gnarls, receives our footfalls beat. For a time we walk together, but then he runs away, as fast as his boy's legs can pace. Against the distance speeds his race, as sun released from darkness tether to course a newer day. And transverse to his joyful path, The river makes a cross and swells beneath the bridge's frame, both changing and always the same, both origin and aftermath, both utter gift and loss. So I watch at a standstill, lost within the widening gap, and he grows smaller with each stride, like boats departing with the tide. My wandering with his has crossed. His path I cannot map. I cannot my own son deliver. Thus is the future past. I hear my voice, by time defiled. Where do you run so fast, my child? Where runs the movement of the river? Why does it run so fast? And now, after that wonderfully cheery poem, there's another one which also is about death. So you'll be happy to know that that's a theme here. This one is another localist poem, I guess you could say. And it has the added benefit of being about an agricultural process. So, maple tapping. I like the process, boring into wood by hand, the blade's sharp drill bit piercing, good and deep, clearing the hole so that the sap drips sweetly down the bark. Then every tap gets tapped in, buckets all hung tree by tree, then waiting day by chilly day to see and listen for the sap fall drop by drop. Some days it seems like it will never stop. Some days you check, and all is hard as hail, the tree's blood marbled, frozen in its pail, still and unliving. Some days they are full as fruit that swells towards our planet's pole, with water moving clear and light as thought, bearing within a sweetness tasted not, until the fire distill it. Sparks will fly all night through smoke that pours into a sky, where all the stars shine clearly. Reading, sipping a whiskey, skimming the sap, feeding the flames with seasoned pine, hearing the rhyme that silence makes with silence, feeling time move slowly. Patience lets you feel its firm, insistent hand, which brings all things to term. But as I checked the buckets yesterday, as sun shone slantwise towards a Saturday, I found a deer mouse, drowned, afloat inside, compassed within the circle of that tide. However it came, the wall's aluminum kept it from climbing out to escape its doom. I thought about what it must have been like, its panic, as its heart began to spike, the elfin muscles burning, worked to final exhaustion in its most essential, primal task, with its pointed nose kept quivering above the veil of water, shivering, tail arched below the minute plashing waves, each ripple smothering, even as it laves. One cannot understand that sheer sensation, unreasoned hope and fear in combination, but without knowledge, thought, or consciousness. The neural paths alight with weariness. Its body then is one entire groan, as it attempts, but vainly, to postpone against inevitable black unmaking, from which there is no rebirth or awaking. Total animality distilled from what is living into what is killed. From energy to mere material, motion departed, flesh finds release into its deformation and decease. It nearly seemed something within the tree that dwelt where I could not confirm or see, demanded blindly life for taken life, and felt my drill as I might feel a knife. Thus brought about again these mortal changes, since Earth's whole household thrives on such exchanges. This next one is another wintry poem, but with a slightly warmer note, and it's called A Domestic Note. And it's addressed to my wife, which you'll figure out pretty quickly from the first line. So. While you were dealing with the kids upstairs, I came inside from shoveling the snow, as more descended, to erase my labor in white futility. I saw your bread, which you had made the afternoon before. I used the paring knife to cut a slice, and then thick slabs of sweet and salted butter. Impatiently, In hunger's hollow need, the bread was toasted, smeared, and then I ate, well savoring the butter that had sunk into the bread and stained it dark with fat, and smacked of salt and cream against the tongue. The gray-brown crust was tough and partly cracked, and flecked throughout with oats and flax and hemp. It smelled to me as warm bread always smells, but you were not saving it for anything. You made it by yourself while I was at the office, so that I could do just this, and know it finally as a gift of sorts, if by a gift you understand a thing not owed, expected, and yet needed in some small way and desired. Something good, like kind words on a troubled day, embraces that are completely meant and last too long. And so, without transgression, without guilt, I ate what you, the woman given to me, gave me in turn, without confounding love with mere desire's confection or release, but knowing it as needful for our life, as a meal that follows heavy work, or manna in the wind-swept wilderness. And there are 2 lines in that poem, one of which Professor Wilson was instrumental in keeping, and the last one, which he wished to delete, which I decided to keep in a rare moment of rebellion against tradition and authority. And this is another poem. Maybe there is more of a localist tinge to this than I thought, because this is an autumnal poem, which is fitting, given the time. It's called Adam in Autumn, and it too is dedicated to my wife. Let you and I and our love lie beneath the vaulting, buttressed sky. The leaves, like old stained glass, admit the light by which our love is lit, until they shatter and fall down, to give earth's breast a gold-red gown of crackling fragments which we spread in fiery crowns about our head. A rare example of an early poem that was actually worth something. The next poem is called The 5 Ages. And for those, the 5 Ages are a kind of repeated motif in classical literature in which human history is talked about in terms of a decline from an Edenic golden age to the current age, the Iron Age. And no matter which age people are writing about, their age is always the Iron Age, no matter where you are. So this is a poem that's basically just describing each of the 5 ages, one per stanza. That eon prime of gold, which grew not dull nor old, was drained, like mellow ripening wine. But of the wheel 5-fold now here, and in your mind behold each age. How in that silver age malign, men hung like unripe fruit on the vine, from the matriarchal fold and pap inept to all design, unmanned and caught in safety as a cage. At length men build, engage, combine in bronze to clamp their hold with force upon the world. The alchemage with logic's codex scrolled attempts all nature to refine. That fine heroic mold was cast of bronze and centaur's tutelage. They ranted, raped like gods upon a stage, and burnt up mediocrity in rage, and dying pired the dead for shrine. Yet this did fall, no lasting heritage. The good are bought and sold. As songbirds fluttering in a mine, men live in dark and live on darkness wage, the Iron Age, unsold. As you can see, I'm a very cheerful poet. But maybe if I read too much about current events, that's the kind of thing that gets produced. This next one is a little more hopeful. And it's called A Meal. And this actually comes directly out of the MFA program. The assignment was to write a poem that expressed a kind of cosmic view of something, but preferably using something not directly cosmic, so not necessarily talking about galaxies or the Big Bang or something. So with that in mind, I chose the idea of a meal, and this is what came out. There's something holding in and up the edges of our whole universe, the crystal lip keeping the wine from spilling on the cloth, which rests outspread on swung-out drop-leaf ledges. There's something framing it in filigree, gold trim, fantastic round the rim of bone, ground fine and heated into form of porcelain, with lacquered fleur-de-lis. White candles lend it the low lights that blend both passing joy and long anticipation, which is the unknown guest at every meal, the grace at its beginning and its end. There may be, after supper, port and cigars. Its scheme and map may be of formal nonsense, quite free from all necessity, that men might empty blood, bread, roasts, and caviars into the dark of an imagined, yet not one whit less required need. The speech should be refined, amusing, taut, the silver service like an amulet, and every gesture kept within its bounds, so that the whole is borne in every part, like champagne flutes that clink together well, the moon-bright boat of sauce that makes the rounds. There now, the meal is ending. See each guest depart alone into the outer room. The conversation may continue there, or maybe they have fallen into rest. But each knows that the ritual's complete. And they have been there, joined its formal work without pretension or denial of their nature, silent and replete. And then, let's see, another poem about eating and drinking. This one is called Holiday, presumably because I wrote it during summer vacation when I was teaching. And the idea here is that both the good things of this life are celebrated and at the same time pushed against and resisted. And I think that will become fairly clear once you hear the poem. So little under heaven is sweeter than a gin and tonic at 11. Wind ripples cherry skirts, uncovers cream-soft skin as she now sways, now flirts. It is a very natural perfection, preventing us at least from disaffection. Oh, let Lord Bacchus bless beer cans snap and hiss, pent pop of champagne cork and gin caps crackling torque. Let speech be lifted up in silver plate and cup. Let there be cocktails on the lawn at 8 to help us love the life we cannot hate. O may Lord Bacchus keep tobacco's tinder rustle, blue strand of lithe smoke's leap, warm round of light brown muscle, crystals chime in parlor, ring of late night laughter. The garden lilts with whispers and brown eyes. We are not over-righteous, over-wise. And breathe benignities upon bare necks and knees. On all meat meals, this fate where vanities unhindered, view charity's fine flindered candlelight lit late. Remember nothing. Nothing loved will last. All feasts resolve in everlasting fast. The next two poems are from a series of poems that I did on the deadly sins. And I decided to write this series as sonnets. So they're both sonnets, and they're each on one of the deadlies. Now I used one of the, for some reason which I cannot now recall, I decided to use one of the older lists of deadly sins, in which there were 8 rather than 7. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe I thought based on the schema that I could work more with certain sins versus others, depict them more easily. But the two I'm going to deliver you today are pride and wrath. And first, pride. And there's a little epigraph before each one. The epigraph for pride is from Troilus and Cressida by Chaucer. Oh, sorry, I think Shakespeare here. He that is proud eats up himself. Subtler than thought, this note, that tremulous at first, begins the piece. Yet as the song proceeds, both sweet and deep, harmonious, it sounds itself more brilliant and strong. At first it bends and dances with the others, and seems with them to have redeemed the time. But as its own theme grows, it turns and smothers each brighter sound with which it cannot chime. It is the first and last note of the soul, as it performs before itself. Its needs are ours, identically. It is the whole damned symphony of human loves and deeds. Its noise is silence, dying on its lips, both self-creation and apocalypse. And that poem, I think, I was thinking a little bit of the Silmarillion, where the evil angel is interfering with the creative harmony and music of God. The next one is called Wrath. And the epigraph is from the 19th Psalm. Sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. The pale Venetian blinds are hung across the paler dying of the distant light. And at the furthest cup of final loss, he grinds his teeth in desiccated might. His final day descends towards its close. Its thwarted minutes scream at him to live. But in that hospital alone, he knows there's not a single reason to forgive. Thus he rejects the world, and everyone and every grace that could have come from strife. And twisting on his bed to see the sun, spits out one final curse against his life. Implacable, he turns his back toward the wall, and takes revenge on nothing and on all. And I should mention that in those two poems and in the rest of the sequence, my goal is not to meditate in a kind of morbid way on evil for its own sake, but to kind of reveal both to myself and hopefully to whoever's reading it, the sin as it is, right? Hopefully provide some kind of moral example about the evil that comes from these sins. The last poem in my selection here is actually a translation from Charles Baudelaire. And I picked this translation first and foremost because it sounded nice to me, but also because Baudelaire has had an effect on me as a poet in one way or another. He also had an effect on T.S. Eliot, who's a poet who's very important to me. And I found this out only a couple months ago. Professor Wilson also did a translation of this very poem. I believe it's collected now in Some Permanent Things. But I had done this before I knew that, but I thought it would be a good thing to read here tonight. And it's called Correspondences. And the sort of general idea behind this poem is simply that it's talking about the way in which we interpret the world and the way in which beauty elevates the soul to look on things beyond itself. So it's called Correspondences. Nature's broad temple stands. Her pillars, live within, breathe out a flux of words, misunderstood. Men cross the outlands of that sacramental wood, which yet observes, regards him with the look of kin. As far-flung echoes which afar themselves confound within one simple, tenebrous profundity, as vast as empty night and daylight's clarity, the perfumes, colors, and sonorities resound. For there are perfumes fresh as babes newborn, as sweet as singing woodwind, verdant as vast plateaus, and others, rotting, rich, which triumph will adorn, keeping close-coiled infinity that spreads and grows. As amber, musk, benzoin, frankincense, which canticle the transports of both soul and sense. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you to the Fahey's and to Thomas More for inviting me out here. I have long wanted to visit, and I finally fulfilled that aim. Thank you to Michael for reading first. It's a great delight to hear poems aloud that I have read in manuscript, sometimes 2 or 3 years earlier, and say, yeah, that's a good change. It's a great pleasure, in fact. Tonight is in a small preliminary way a celebration for Michael Yost and I, because we have just cemented some of the final details that will allow us to begin in fall of 2025 the publication of a new journal of Catholic arts and letters called the Colosseum, named after a journal that ran in the 1930s that was started by Christopher Dawson, also called the Colosseum. Many years ago, how many years ago? On my honeymoon. Why on my honeymoon? Because this is how we afforded a honeymoon when you're a poor graduate student. Our honeymoon consisted of me doing lectures in Europe and then going to an archive in eastern France to study the Jacques Maritain papers, and that's how you afford to do these things if you have no money. Bill it to somebody else. So while you will cry for our poverty, because my wife and I on our honeymoon, we had to settle for 3 weeks in Europe, which I earned my keep by giving lectures, but and that included this week at the Maritain papers in Kolbsheim, just near Strasbourg in France, where Maritain's papers are permanently stored in a chateau. So we had to live in a chateau. It was a real pain when the sun came in through our private courtyard in the morning. But as I was going through those papers, I found some amazing things, and I was so stupid that I didn't photograph all of them. I did photograph some things, like T.S. Eliot's Christmas card to Jacques Maritain. I have a picture of that, and I have a letter from Alan Tate writing to Maritain, typed up. I took a picture of to Maritain. In fact, I took a still from it and put it on my first chapbook of poems. But as I was going through all of these papers, I came across this magazine I'd certainly never heard of before, called the Colosseum. I saw that it was edited by the great historian Christopher Dawson, and in its pages I saw things that were astonishing to me. First of all, this was from 1930. It was a close reading of Eliot's The Waste Land that read it as a Catholic poem, which is the correct reading of the poem. It's the reading that Eliot couldn't have given when he wrote it in 1922, but it's the reading that he would have understood, that would have made sense to him as he went through his own spiritual maturation in the decade that followed the publication of that poem. It was marvelous. And similarly, there was an interview with a certain novelist that at least one person in this room has heard, named Sigrid Undset. And she was talking about a Nobel Prize that she had won for some book called Christian Slavensdatter. And I thought, what's this? This looks really good. How come I don't know about this? I have a PhD. So that's what you get for going to Notre Dame. So I just thought, this is phenomenal. This is what Catholic culture looks like. And so many years later, Franciscan University at Steubenville invited me to start an imprint, so basically a small press within a small press within a big press, called Colosseum, which I called Colosseum Books. And so we've now published 8 or 9 books, with many more to come, of poetry and literary criticism. And we thought that the next stage of growth would be to refound the Colosseum, which will not involve martyring too many people, but will involve a lot of work that may feel like martyrdom, which is why I will be the publisher of this magazine, and Michael Yost will be our managing editor. So I'm very excited to welcome Michael aboard and to see that first issue go to press sometime this summer. That will feature, I don't think I'm getting ahead of myself here, but will feature an interview and poems with Anthony Esselin, and as well as other writings by great Catholic writers of our day. And I want to just briefly, before turning to my own work, to thank A.M. Juster for his support of this project as we begin it. So hopefully you will all be subscribers to the Coliseum a year from now. And if you're not, you don't need to apologize to me when you don't subscribe if you step into the other room that's just on the other side of that wall after this reading and buy a copy of my latest book of poems, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds. If you do neither of those things, I actually don't know how to finish that. I was thinking as Michael was talking about his Seven Deadly Sins poems, and I published 2 or 3.
It's 8.
How many did I publish, though?
2.
Okay, so I published 2 of those sonnets in Modern Age magazine this last year, and I would have really liked to have been present at the committee when they said, okay, we're going to reduce the total number of sins from 8 to 7. And I would have, what kind of lobbying group would have been, can we get rid of lust? Come on, take gluttony off, it'll be fine. Just let me finish these potato chips. So, okay. So yeah, it would have been wonderful. So, alas, it seems like there's plenty of sins, even though they took one off. Okay, so let me share a few poems with you from St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds. And I think I'm going to... How tired are you? Can you listen to a story? Yes? Okay. All right. Too bad. No, okay, I'll send you a story. I'll do a few short poems, and then I'll read you a story. And I think I'm going to put my glasses on because I'm getting old. It's a very short poem called Lilacs. You stand beneath the lilac bush at night and smell her heavy blossoms. Think, right, I've caught this scent 1,000 times before, which, subtle though it is, you can't ignore. It fills the mind and yet escapes it, too, as every mystery worth the name will do. Perhaps that's why, like baby faces, ants, the curious innards of a marshland's plants, like love songs or the neighbor's lab you pet, no matter how familiar, we get a pulse of wonder and a hint of fear that some ethereal visitant draws near. I have to make a footnote on that poem, which was speaking of the aforementioned A.M. Juster, when I was reading his most recent book of poems, as I remarked in the review I wrote, at several times I was compelled to stop and write my own poem, and that happened 4 times in the course of the composition of the book. And I think that was the first one, Mike. So if you don't like that poem, write better poems next time, okay? Let's see here. Oh gosh, let's keep it a Juster-themed thing for just a moment. Here's a poem that first appeared in First Things magazine when Mike was the poetry editor. This book of mine is an exploration of 2 things, at least 2 things, but at minimum 2 things, and that's the presence of evil in our history and the way in which the human response to evil has consistently never been despair, but to see through evil to something more foundational. And you're all Thomas More students. You know how being works, and that goodness is primary, and evil is at best secondary. And so you understand the metaphysics behind such a vision. But understanding the metaphysics is only the beginning of things. So here's a poem that's written after a photograph by Richard Peter called Daiguta. And if you know this photograph, it's a famous or even infamous one. It's in its own way a beautiful, but also a horrifying photograph. And it's of the statue of goodness, Daigut, in Dresden. And the statue of goodness, which somehow is still intact, overlooks down below the massive level devastation of the bombing of the city of Dresden. And I was moved to write this not just because of the beauty of that photograph, but because of my shock and surprise at the way in which people, even in the most desperate moments of the Second World War, were already thinking to how they were going to build after the war. That goes for the Nazis, which is a little creepy, but for everybody. Waking in Dresden. Her shoulders slumped beneath their heavy cloak, large hands outspread despite a shattered thumb. The lady goodness stares out on the smoke and ruin below and stands, as always, dumb. More planes already drone on the horizon, their bellies pregnant with the bombs they hoard. And as she rests her ever-restful eyes on the ancient stones, they lose their long accord. Everyone waking this peculiar morning must stare in wonder at what's been destroyed, and put on stony black in silent mourning, and silent ask what's left to be enjoyed. The shame of the adulterer, the drunk, the gambler who steals from his boss's till, the shame in which the desperate are sunk to give their flesh as toy to others' will. The shame of him who said the cause was just and let that payload whistle down to earth and level all once risen back to dust would seem to silence any talk of birth. And here she stands, that sculpted goodness, mute, incapable of speaking her own name, as if all life were cut back to the root, and all that's left were to assign the blame. But in the silence of her weathered mind, and in some 1,000 other places now, despite themselves, not to such wreckage blind, the living wonder and start plotting how they might rebuild what lies there and still burns. They stare up from the shelter's open door and see the clearness of the sky returns as dust of bone drifts round the brightening floor. So if that's looking into the catastrophe of history and being shocked, a little bit appalled to find any sign of hope, here's a poem that does the same, but in a different way, and I must confess this also A.M. Juster published. I did not intend this reading to go this way, but here we are. And this is the title poem from this new book, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds. And I'll have to say just one note of preface. Who it was, I don't recall, but someone dared to claim years ago that the great Catholic tradition of exegesis, of the fourfold sense of Scripture, was something that was totally allergic or impossible within the context of Thomas Aquinas' scholasticism. And I was willing to believe that person until I saw Thomas Aquinas doing it. And I thought, well, you need to do more reading. So, I had that experience once years ago when I was going through the treatise on laws and came across Thomas Aquinas' account of the Mosaic Law and why, for instance, you couldn't eat certain kinds of birds. Why are they prohibited by the law of Moses? And as I was reading through Thomas Aquinas' own words, I thought two things. I thought, first of all, here is a moment when the highest feat of scholastic theology has utterly merged with a medieval bestiary. And that's a very good synthesis. And then my second thought was, this needs to be put in couplets. This needs to be in heroic couplets. So I just sat down and started putting Aquinas on the birds into couplets. And before long, and I've lived with Thomas Aquinas for 30 years, happily, not literally, that the picture of the dumb ox or the ox of God rose up pretty quickly, and I saw exactly what he would have been doing as he dictated these lines of the Summa. I had some help because on that same honeymoon that I was bragging about earlier with such shamelessness, while in Rome, we went to the Dominican church where Aquinas wrote part of the Summa. Anyhow, so I've been to the scene of the crime. So here is St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, and just note that the best lines in this poem are from Aquinas, not from me. Beyond the window, morning sparrows made their song, as if the whole world's goodness paid its plenty out for them and them alone. The old saint heard their joy and squelched a moan as his legs, stiff and heavy still with sleep, arranged themselves beneath his cassocked heap of belly. Where had he left off before? He asked his three amanuenses, more for their sakes, sprightly fingers, sluggish minds, than his. One said, with the forbidden kinds of birds, and what their figures signified for Moses, who charged the eagle's flight with pride. Aquinas sat a moment, mind withdrawn from his mouth's taste of buttered loaves, the dawn without, the wish for more wood in the fire to clear the frost from stone, or to admire the cool, swift brilliance of all he said, as a swan plumes its white and well-turned head. He spoke. The long-beaked ibis feeds on snakes to represent the man whom nothing slakes. Feasting upon dead bodies' open gore, the vulture stands for all who thrive through war. When Noah let the raven out to fly, it never did return, to signify such men whose souls are blackened by foul lust, or who, unkind, won't pay back trust with trust. The plodding puffball ostrich is that which figures all those weighed down with growing rich, and hearing God's call plant their soiled head. Plovers like gossips on stray words are fed. And who, on seeing the gull, does not admire that its bright wings to heaven may aspire, and yet it wastes its hours adrift at sea, gorging on fishy sensuality. The hoopoe builds its nest on heaps of dung, just as despair's eyes view the world all wrong. He paused then, at the thought of earthly sorrows, our sickly past, incarnadine tomorrows, the myriad things that whistle arcane truth to please old minds and to instruct raw youth, and bore down on his broken knees to pray for such a world that had so much to say. The great state of Alaska. When we signed up to take a week-long cruise, docking in scenic ports along the coast of the great state of Alaska, our friends cooed. Their voice betrayed that kind of awe and envy which skips ahead a few weeks to the future, postpones and puts far out of mind the vision of hosts of angels in their fearsome brilliance, descending with their swords out at the world's end. It clears a place in thought to feel warm water lapping against one's slick, recumbent shoulders, to sense a grip both firm and gentle, as the manicurist pares one's nails and smooths fingers grown stubbed and raw in winter air. One's cheeks grow pink and young in such a thought. "You're going to love it," my friend Baxter said. "Maybe you'll see a bear." "You'll see a bear," he added, and then walked away content, humming the same. Start that paragraph just one more time, thank you. I'm a very sentimental person, so I'm always crying. Okay, all right, here we go. "You're going to love it," my friend Baxter said. "Maybe you'll see a bear." "You'll see a bear," he added, and then walked away content, humming the same three notes in random sequence, and vanished down the row of cubicles. My wife's great aunt, a veteran in such matters, advised that we could keep aboard the ship, even in port, to savor the buffets. "That's when you get the best of it," she said. "They have to carve as much beef as you want." I have a very specific sense of humor. Okay. From where we stood on deck, the world rose up above us with the sweep of granite bowls. Trees at the base, which spread as thick as moss, then thinned until the weathered crown stood bare, pockmarked with remnants of the ancient snows. The dome above us, gray and strained with clouds, hung like a marble tablet that had cracked. Old women, traveling without their husbands, smiled at us as if we were newlyweds. During the banquet, as the ship left port, one placed a hand of cool, soft, paper-thin flesh on my own, and begged us love each other as her third husband loved her till the end. My wife's eyes glistened as if very moved. I looked down at the woman's rings and nodded. We lived from meal to meal, and each was long and stuffing. The cuisine, a far-flung hodgepodge of Thai, bread pudding, marinara sauce, great pork loins shaved beneath the orangey heat lamps. And every seat, repose for those who'd come for something so enduring, it had sought a stronghold here among the glacial bluffs. Man's every urge, no matter how unlikely, including even the impossible desire to be thought wise regarding love, must somehow find its final refuge there. One morning, with the ship drawn into shore and mist still hovering where the mountains' backs, like great indifferent beasts, passed one another, we trailed our fellow tourists down the dock and headed inland toward the Mendenhall, with various promised stops along the way. The promises of one remain with me. The bus was crowded, quiet, save for coughs that shook some septuagenarian out of his upright snooze. The gravelly roads lulled everyone toward sleep, and my wife's head grew heavy on my shoulder as we snaked around the bases of the coastal range, then up. The tired engine groaned and groaned, then stopped beneath a sky of towering firs. The driver sat there as if lost, until a man named Caleb bounded up the steps and stirred us with his scratchy, shouting voice to come, to follow him, at last descend into a clearing. Back behind him lay a massive greenhouse. All about us, posted in earth like pillars, stood inverted trunks of spruce and hemlock, fluted bowls pitched upward, and where once long ago the roots had clutched, now overflowed the cheery, pied strands of wildflowers, blessed, dangling in the breeze. It was no more than 15 years ago, Caleb began. A man the world now knows as Ray came here and stood in this same plot. The land about him was a waste and void. The mountainside stood on the very brink, one deluge more of sliding out to sea, carrying with it what few broken stumps and ruins from an old prospector's camp lay moldering about the steep terrain. Mounting his excavator, Ray began to lodge into the dirt the trunks that had been felled. He jammed their tops to earthward, plunged them deep, and then, a lumberjack, he scaled those trunks and tossed into the elevated bowls the seeds of every flower native here, till from such wreckage he had built this temple, this place of florid beauty where we stand. Caleb stood silent, overwhelmed with awe, and watched the Oddway's grandeur sinking in. He was not done, but led us, rather, up the ribbon of a trail through woods infested with devil's club, with trees that rose up from the soft, moss-coated, rotting humps of trunks, whose open bark spilled out their nourishing guts. It was a brilliant darkness, lush with life fed off of life, the slow stir of the air carrying the drift of salt in from the sea, and punctuated by the scent of Rosa rugosa and delphiniums that grew wherever sunlight reached the sloping floor. Ray saved my life, our guide continued. Was a second chance when I'd been lost and wandering. He said, "Your heart's broke, but you've got strong hands." Tammy, Ray's wife, had done the same for others, apparently, and everyone who worked the gardens owed their happiness to them. 2 orphan Eskimos had found a home at last. An aged stevedore now spent his days in charge of shaping up the bonsai. A troop of girls who lost their way up north by mystery and tragedy had come to dwell as dryads over leaf and bud. Beneath us, we heard someone chopping wood, a strange hymn floating round each hack, as if the rhythm of the earth had found its voice and mended every wound with harmony. At last, we came out on the mountain crest, a broad pole shelter running near the cliff's edge, and in the center of a gravel plain, the black and smoldering remnants of a fire. Again he spoke. Last night, beneath the stars, the daughter Ray and Tammy gave the world, was married here, and Ray performed the nuptials. The drums, guitar, and dancing went till dawn. I haven't slept myself, but most our staff is home this morning, or snuck off to nap in one of those small hikers' lodges Ray constructed from the timber of old Juno. The gravel bore the prints of faded feet, I thought, and heard, or thought I heard, the sound of empty bottles juggled through the air and laughter at some clownish jubilation, as in the spell of celebration each whirled crowns of flowers in the vacancies. I stared from high down on the continent that opened wide before us, and could see the foot trails leading pilgrims from afar, from all the settled tracks and spoiled cities, to here where Ray and Tammy promised hope. Aboard ship once again. The dining room was lit aglow with golden candelabras. A string quartet swayed slowly back and forth and threaded all the air with some baroque melody leading somewhere that escaped me. Women with elegance turned here and there, making their way between the feasting tables in gowns of blue or black, their breasts encrusted with diamonds multiplying light on light. Waiters flowed from the kitchen like champagne, their trays weighed down by plates of duck or lobster, and just beyond the fullness of our chatter, we saw the crowded heads of children laughing, as with his dapper hat and gloves and cane, a coy magician summoned doves from nowhere. But even then, our exultation ripe amid the clank of silver knives, the music, our heads grown light and vaporous and aswim with cold and potent daiquiris, I heard the coughs begin. And in the days ahead, the ship begun to roll as it pushed out far into the Pacific. All land vanished. We lay upon the twin beds in our stateroom. A deep and bellowing whoop within our chests, our bodies churning, pulled away from us, as if a drain had opened deep inside them, as if they'd lose themselves within the deep. And as I gripped the corner of my mattress, I thought that, yes, the world may be a temple that opens onto somewhere not itself, much as black water opens wide its doors to take within itself the giant orcas that leap, then twist, and fall with straining backs. But no grove in its belly was a saved land. No peak forever shelters us from nausea. No place so fortifies itself that all becomes an everlasting dance of moonlight. The engines sluicing water far below us and drawing us indifferently along from port to port, and none the final one, I slowly came to know. No Tammy, nor had ever been. That's it.
Patrick and I are both very curious. What is the eighth deadly sin that was removed?
I think it's a distinction they made between pride and vainglory. So pride being, well, pride as we normally think, but then vainglory being seeking after kleos, honor, glory. Yeah.
So like the sin and synodality, it didn't do anything.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, alas. Oh, there's one.
Would you mind saying something about Hopkins and whether or not he influenced either of your work? Because there are a few moments in both of your poems that sounded very Hopkinsian, but I might have some part of that in there.
Yeah, somebody said recently, a critic said recently, and I don't remember in what context, but talking about some other contemporary poet, this guy's influenced by Hopkins, and that's unusual. And I thought, what are you talking about? There's no poet alive who directly or indirectly doesn't bear the imprint of Hopkins. The reassertion of alliteration and I mean not as a structural feature of poetry, as in the Anglo-Saxon, but as a figure of speech, as one of the things we do with language, that owes a lot to Hopkins. And for my part, all my, in iambic pentameter, all my verses iambic pentameter, it's not the sort of loose sprung rhythm that Hopkins was talking about, but I often experiment with having multiple, heavily stressed iambs, on the Richter scale of iambs that Timothy Steele gives us from 1 to 4, like 3s and 4s next to each other. And that's Hopkins. What do you think, Michael?
Less than that. I only really know one Hopkins poem by heart, and it's the one about this darksome burn horseback round. What's that one called? Impersonate. Okay. So I mean, I guess I like me some alliteration. That's probably about as far as it goes. But there is an occasional. The sonic quality, the kind of the granularity of some of Hopkins' language is kind of something I occasionally levitate. So maybe I was trying to think as you asked your question what poems in my collection might have been influenced by Hopkins. I guess the holiday one probably, just because, yeah, that might be it. But I haven't read enough Hopkins for him to be a major influence, I think. But his language is infectious sometimes, so that could be it.
Hopkins is a reminder of something that I'm often reflecting on, and that is that literature more broadly begins in suffering. Our oldest literary forms in our tradition are tragic and epic, and epic always has a little bit of a melancholy tint to it, because we think of the Iliad more than the Odyssey, first of all. And so for the novelists and short story writers, that's been a real burden, because it's hard for them to imagine what a happy story would look like, or to write a comedy in the classical sense. Poets in this respect only perhaps, have been a little bit easier in that there's always been a great poetic literature of praise. And of course Hopkins is one of the great poets of praise. And so it's the ability to be able to say, I can simply acclaim the greatness of God from time to time, and there's nothing wrong with that. is actually a great sort of liberating quality. Didn't you publish an essay on Claudel?
Yeah.
Yeah, Claudel's another great example of that, of the poet, the doxological poets, the poets of praise. Amy, and then back there.
I have a kind of follow-up question to that. And, when you were leading the students this afternoon, you pointed out certain indebtedness, that there were certain allusions to particular poets or poems. But I'm always wondering, to what extent, if you're so immersed in the poetic tradition, that have you ever been kind of caught up short by someone saying, oh, this is from this poet, or when you use this word, it clearly is in this tradition, where the tradition itself becomes a kind of muscle memory, so that you're not actually thinking, oh, if I use the word trod, I'm nodding to Hopkins, or so to what extent do you think that's true of the tradition? Because I'm always kind of in awe of great poets and thinking about intentionality, but then I think, well, if it's in all intentionality, then how did they do it? At a certain point, the tradition and what they've read just becomes part of, Keats is writing, Ode to a Nightingale on one morning in 1819 in the space of several hours, but he's got all of that reading behind him, so I don't know, have you ever felt like, oh yes, I that was in there, but I wasn't actually thinking about that? That's kind of a strange question.
That's interesting.
But has anyone ever pointed out to you
Well, so few people have read my poetry.
Yeah.
Now, so. Sometimes I've gone back and listened to a poem and thought, oh, that sounds a lot like the line from this poem. And it's usually after the fact, but I'm sure that great poets in the tradition were both conscious and unconscious at the same time. It'd be hard to imagine that Virgil, for example, was not reflexively Homeric to some degree, for example.
As opposed to studiedly Homeric?
Yeah, which he also
that
was.
too.
Yeah.
I was more interested in hearing what Michael had to say about that, because I published a long essay on this called On Poetic Traditions, my sense of how poems work is that poems just come out of other poems. This will be familiar to a lot of you, just that when we're talking about a tradition, we really have to think about traditions the way Alistair McIntyre describes them, as traditions are effectively languages. So you can't do anything untraditional in the same way that you can't speak English without speaking English. It's the language that's given to you. And so to write a new poem entails nothing other than taking the vocabulary that's been given you and using it in a new way, but all of its parts come from elsewhere. All of its parts come from the past. There's no, people like to, especially at Catholic colleges, like to quote Tolkien on subcreation. I'd heard that word 100 times at different small Catholic colleges before I knew what it was. It's like, what is that, like making sandwiches? But I knew I wasn't, whenever I found out what that word meant, I wasn't going to like it. And it turns out I was right, even though I love Tolkien, of course. But and that's because it's not even worth talking about creation. There's only one act of creation, and we're operating within that condition. Does anybody else want to sing for us? And so, in my view, every line is a reflection of the poems. Poems are made out of other poems, and that's why I was asking you those leading questions this afternoon, because I was trying to see if you saw stuff I hadn't seen in my poems, because I knew what I'd seen, but I wasn't sure what else there might be. And especially in that poem that I read for the students today, in the holding cell, I was just like, I have no idea what this poem's even about. And I'm just hoping somebody will tell me. Made sense at the time.
It reminds me a little bit of, we mentioned this at dinner, but T.S. Eliot's essay on conscious and unconscious religious poetry, where in his essay he makes the case that consciously religious poetry is often propagandistic, whereas unconsciously religious poetry is often more tethered to a reflection and imitation of the reality we experience. So this may be heretical, but the examples he uses are Chesterton and Dante, and Dante is obviously the unconsciously religious poet here, writer, and then Chesterton is the more consciously reactive, reactionarily religious writer and poet. And I feel as if having a debt to the tradition is you kind of have to be conscious and unconscious at the same time, and if you don't have both, then there's probably something lacking. So.
There was a question right there. Yeah.
I noticed a certain trajectory within your poems that was comparing the two of you very similar, but with an important difference. With Mr. Yost, it seemed like you started with contemplating an experience, and then that leading to a kind of despair. We saw that with the Dormouse. We saw that with the line, "All feasts resolve in everlasting fast" at the end of the line, and then that's where the poem takes you.
Yeah.
It's similar in your poems, Mr. Wilson, except that's not where you end. That's where you get to at some point in the middle of the poem. For example, with the everybody getting sick on the cruise, or in the poem about remembering how we're forgetting everything and going back into oblivion. But that's not where the poem ends. It then it goes through that to, maybe you could call it absurdity, is what we experience on the cruise ship, which then leads us back up to humor, to hope, or to something that's brighter than that place of despair that we were before. So my question to you is, can we expect the trajectory of the student to mature into the trajectory of the teacher as the student's career goes on?
Cute. Do you want to take that, or I don't know.
Would I ask?
Well,
Michael will come along nicely.
yeah. Well, so one thing I think to note is that while a poem, especially in the lyric tradition, right, not every poem I think especially in the lyric tradition, not every poem is meant to stand on its own, right? So you can be an admirer of a certain poet and appreciate, and hopefully this is the case with you and reading me, you can appreciate what a certain poem is reflecting insofar as it's reflecting an experience or a certain reception of certain realities. And as far as the charge of despair goes, it's something that I think is present even in Scripture, right? You have the book of Ecclesiastes. I mean, where's the exception to the phrase, vanity of vanities, all is vanity? Where's the asterisk? It's not in that book. It's in the rest of the Bible, right? So I think there's also something to be said for the poet trying to work through his own interests and feelings and all that romantic stuff, but also trying to bring the reader to a sense of the gravity of certain realities, and then leaving him to make up his own mind about what comes after. So that would be my brief defense, my apologia.
Yeah, I think poems in general are pretty dialectical, and they don't always have the whole dialogue within themselves that an individual, especially a lyric poem, can really only do so much, and it's often done its work when it simply captures a single mood. I was thinking of this the other night, because I think W.H. Auden does this maybe more accessibly than most modern poets. For instance, he'll have a poem, if you know his poem, Funeral Blues. It was my East. Don't you have that memorized, Zena? Yeah. So ask Zena afterwards if you want to hear it. It's just about despair at somebody being dead, and it's hyperbolic. The world's over, but that's an appropriate thing to do within one poem, and then to do its antithesis in another poem. And some individual poems can contain that sort of whatever you want to call it, that dialectical in the Platonic sense or dialogical movement within themselves. I think, in fact, this is why good reading in general in the humane tradition actually always has to be dialectical. I've been going around the country telling people they need to read more like Plato, which means to learn to read more like a poet, and really take things whole rather than just abstracting individual arguments from within it. I'll just give you one example of it, because it was one that was born into me this summer. I was reading the Hippias Major this summer, which I I will always think is probably Plato's most funny dialogue. It's really, the sarcasm is so thick. But in that dialogue, it's on the question of beauty, and Socrates gets Hippias to say, well, beauty has something to do with vision and hearing. And Socrates says, but vision and hearing don't have anything in common. So how can you know what beauty is if you're saying that beauty has something to do with these two things that have nothing to do with one another? And Hippias is just like, I don't know, I guess we don't know what beauty is. And as the dialogue just ends, well, if you go to the Phaedrus or to Aristotle's treatise on the senses, you'll find that within that tradition, within the classical tradition, they all know that beauty does specifically have something to do with vision and hearing, because those, as Aristotle says, are of the five senses, are the most intellectual senses. So we refer to beautiful visions and beautiful words or beautiful music. We don't, in most circumstances, talk about beautiful smells or that back road's really beautiful. You might say that, but they would have said you were making a category mistake. And in fact, the whole Greek tradition sprang up from understanding that somewhat mysterious, not intuitive connection, well, intuitive for Hippias, but not for everybody else, between hearing and vision. And that, in fact, human beings are characterized by their ability to see things and say, what's that? And then they give them a name, elephant. So the combination of hearing and vision come together so that we can begin to form an understanding of reality as such, to enter into communion with being. So my point is simply that in that dialogue, Hippias is actually telling us the truth the final truth, the conclusive truth. He just doesn't know how to formulate it yet. But the dialogue just ends and it says, you think about it for a while. And I think, Plato was a good poet. Poets do that all the time. I presume that Mr. Yost is not leaving us with the dead mice in despair, but asking us to contemplate being a little more deeply.
Even in that poem, there was something hopeful in the last line. But, one of the reasons I didn't want to sound overly pious, but there are a lot of devotional poems that I've written that are kind of imitative. So as poems, they express something genuine that I wanted to write about, but they don't necessarily hold up as individual works. Perhaps it would have been good in this selection to have put at least one of them in, just as a kind of a little a virtue signal, as it were. But I did not. So.
Zine? Oh, sorry, there's a lot of hands. Michael, call somebody.
Lydia.
This is a question that has been bothering me for a while, but what would you consider to be the species-making difference, so to speak, of a Catholic poem? Is it the fact that the author is Catholic, and so how Catholic does he have to be? Is it possible for someone who's completely not a Catholic to write a Catholic poem? And so that would seem to suggest the Catholicity is in the content of the poem. And it seems that there's no one definition that makes, at least I cannot find one that would apply to universally every poem considered to be a Catholic poem. So what will be, I guess to both of you, what would be your opinion on the matter? Thank you.
Do you have an answer?
Oh, go ahead, please.
No, I.
Well, I would say that for one thing, Aristotle tells us that we should only seek for certain knowledge according to the kind of science that we're looking at. So I'm not sure if this is one of those areas where we can seek the kind of super certain specific difference that you're searching for. But at the same time, I think I would tend to hold to a sort of common sense understanding of just considering the text and looking at what, on the whole, probably using the common sense of words, what is said by the poem, almost no matter the author's intention. Now, I think that you also have to kind of tie that somewhat to an understanding that the author, by using certain words, is probably trying to express what those words most normally mean when connected with other words and so on. So I think, I don't think it's just an endless, turtles all the way down situation of text interpreting text, interpreting text, interpreting text. I think you can have legitimate Catholic poets who are writing obviously Catholic poems. Hopkins has poems on the Eucharist, for example, or, it depends on whether you're speaking of Catholicism as Roman Catholicism or Catholicity as being, those things that are expressive of things that are also expressed by Rome. Poems by John Donne, his Holy Sonnets, many of those would be perfectly acceptable in their religious sentiments to a Catholic, but he was not a Roman Catholic. I'm not sure if there's a good answer to your question, really, but I guess, I would say I think primarily there's poems, and then there are some poems that are clearly identifiable as Roman Catholic, but that's all I would really say.
Yeah, you can ask the question in a couple different contexts. If as a critic, as opposed to being just an author or a reader, you might say, well, I'm just curious about to understand so and so is a writer who is a Catholic, and I just want to, and so that's simply interesting for its own sake. I just want to see what this person did in his writing, and what if you see any difference made in how he writes in consequence of the biographical fact of his Catholicism. You could ask the question in other contexts besides that. I'll give you one quick, deliberately bad example, and then what I hope is maybe a slightly stronger example. When it comes to reading fiction, I am deliberately Philistine. I have no interest in going through the great canon of novelists and reading all the best that has been thought and said. I just read whatever I can sit back with a glass of bourbon and enjoy. And sometimes I have picked up books like very, very, very mediocre book, Mr. Blue, which is one of the early Catholic revival novels, not a very good novel. I was like, I just want to read this book because this guy was a Catholic and I know that he's going to deal with Catholic themes and I just want to see what he does with it. And same with Chesterton, whom I love and whom we read in the MFA program, even as we read it in the context of sort of criticizing him. But I would read the Napoleon of Notting Hill over and over again, not because I think it's one of the great novels of all time, just because it's just funny. It's just fun to read it. And so I try to be pretty Catholic in the sense of, promiscuous in my reading in that regard.
That should be on a t-shirt. Catholic in the sense of promiscuous.
Well, they were getting rid of one of the sins, so. But here's I think the more serious answer that really, I think, has a lot that people should be reckoning with. And that is, as I said a little bit ago, our oldest literature is tragic literature. Human literary expression doesn't begin exclusively, but is largely founded in the human experience of pain and the befuddlement of man's fate. And it would be possible, we have, a literature that can only show that can merely show fate and tragedy. But even before Christianity, the ancient philosophers gave us a sense of the horizon of history as not the limit of man's capacities, that through reason, through the intellect, and through the soul, we can rise above even pain and to understand even pain in a context that transcends that pain. Christianity, because of the cross, tells us that the oldest literature has got something foundationally right, that there's a lot of suffering, and that suffering is part of life, and that even the best people often die unjust fates. But it simply refuses to have that as the complete horizon for being, that being transcends those things. And so, in my view, you're writing as a Catholic the moment you recognize that even when you are writing a poem of sorrow, suffering, catastrophe, injustice, despair, that it's always, in some sense, in the context of a more cosmic horizon, a more transcendent horizon that moves beyond these things. But there's two more things that have to be said about that. The first one is this. In the fifth book of Hans Urs von Balthasar's great book, The Glory of the Lord, he says that Christians must be the guardians of metaphysics in the modern age. And what he means by that is, I think, what I just said, that it is easy and possible for the mind to close upon what Orwell called smelly orthodoxies, what Vogelin called ideologies, and to filter out from the world everything except what fits within the confines of that narrow conceptual structure of the ideology. But that Christians are actually obliged to be open to being precisely because being is creation. And so no horizon that is less than fully Catholic or comprehensive of the whole is an adequate such horizon. And so to the extent that one poem may express a narrow horizon, that doesn't de-Catholicize it or delegitimize it, but it can't be the expression of the whole. And just one more. Why must Christians be the guardians of metaphysics? Why must we be open to the whole? I love this paradox that David Schindler first pointed out to me. In the one constitution that came out of the First Vatican Council, as you will probably know, the language of that constitution tells us that anyone who denies that God can be known by natural reason's grasp of being, let him be anathema. I mean, what a marvelous moment in the history of the church. As an article of faith that stakes your soul's possible condemnation upon it, as an article of faith, you are obliged to affirm that your reason, unaided by faith, can attain to a knowledge of God. That's like taking a stake and jamming open the door to being and saying you are not permitted to close your mind upon anything narrow. You actually have an obligation that transcends your reason to allow your reason to attain to the full scope of reality. And I just think that's one of the most amazing moments in human history. That your soul is staked as an article of faith that your reason will be open to being. And I think that's what von Balthasar was talking about. That's what the vocation of the Catholic is, to be open to being.
Thank you, that was an excellent answer.
Tina?
Yeah, that's an excellent question and kind of related to the question I had too, in that when I see anthologies of Catholic poetry, Sally Reed had done one for one of our books, and Ryan Wilson, who teaches at the University of St. Thomas, he has an anthology where you're in also, that everybody that has to, that decides to create an anthology has to define for themselves what falls underneath that category of Catholic poetry. And I'm just wondering, as someone who has created a program that is unlike any other like MFA program that I've seen that is very strong in the Catholic tradition, that for Dr. Wilson and also for Mr. Yost, that as a graduate of a program such as this, like how has it transformed you in terms of your Catholic faith in relation to studying a craft? And what, Dr. Wilson, do you hope that the program will do for the greater Catholic tradition and Catholic arts in general?
Speak loud and glowingly into the mic.
We have the best MFA program. No. So I guess one of the things that I just want to put it in a nutshell. I think if there is a single collapsible point that the program tries to instill in its students, it seems to me, I'm thinking particularly of reading Plotinus, for example, and then reading, books on why the English language is the way it is and why formal structures of language and words and meter exist at all. Reality is ordered, and it's patterned, and reflections of reality, which is what all art is, should also be likewise ordered. And I don't see that as coming per se from the Catholic faith. I think it's present also in, classical philosophy, for example. But it's certainly something that is drawn into the vehicle of Catholicism. It's something that is affirmed again and again by Catholicism, in particular with regards to the doctrine of creation. So I think that might be the short answer for me, for my part. But
That's a good answer.
there you go.
One of the things that has been very pleasing to me as this program has grown and as it's developed and as students have gone through the curriculum was, as you know, everybody begins with the craft of poetry, of just learning the basics of prosody, as Michael was just describing, and then moves through the poetry meditation where they're reading philosophy, theology, and lyric poems together, and then on to eventually taking a philosophy of art and beauty class. And I designed the curriculum, so I kind of knew what was going to happen, but I didn't know what was going to happen. Like do you like her or do you like her? I didn't know no. You know, I knew. And so it was my delight in teaching, you know, at the end of the program, or near the end of the program, the Philosophy of Art and Beauty class, that here we are talking about Plato and Aristotle, and I have students after class say, oh, now I see why you told us to use trochees in this way and not in that way. It's like, I don't know how you made that connection, but that's the connection. In my view, which is not unbiased, but it's also true, is that the goal of the MFA program is to be a whole formation of the person, of the artist, and the works of art that are going to come from that person. And so, to recognizing that every human activity is, in some sense, a vocation, and that it entails spiritual, intellectual, and moral formation along with basic craft and technical instruction, and that those things are inseparable from one another because it's and that those connections should be palpable, that you should feel that yes, thinking about metaphysics has something to do with how I'm going to order words on the page and vice versa. You know, that's no original insight. That's the most ancient wisdom. The reason that Horace, for example, told us that poets were the first priests and lawmakers and politicians is not because he was just in it for the hyperbole, but because he was recognizing that this act of ordering words into verse is a particular kind, but a very meaningful kind of participation in the general cosmic order of creation, and that it's not just a sort of fanciful, you know, flight or of the imagination to move from these basic primordial human activities up to the highest realm of things. That's a very ancient insight, but it's just one that people don't take seriously. They think, oh, that's cute that Horace thought that. Well, no, maybe what if it's true? Then we should probably take it very seriously.
I think we'll probably leave it there,
Yeah.
and if you have further questions, and I think one of the bonuses if you do buy one of the copies of the books is that you'll sign it. Is that right?
That's the incentive. I was just looking for excuses
That's
to
right.
make my signature, so yeah.
But on this question of Catholic literature, we're hosting in the spring, March 22nd, at St. Mary's in Manchester, our 8th annual Catholic Literature Conference, which was cut off for a couple of years during COVID. And the 4 authors that we're discussing are Homer, Jane Austen, Willa Cather, and Robert Frost. None of whom were Catholic. So please come. But thank you so much. And if you want to stay for a few more minutes and have some coffee and conversation. But thank you so much to Dr. Wilson and to Michael Yost for sharing your poetry with us this evening. Thank you.